They never came back from that house. Everyone in our village knew about the abandoned house at the end of Miller's Road, but nobody ever called it abandoned. They called it the place where they disappeared. It stood beyond the cornfields, half hidden by crooked trees and tall grass that never seemed to move in the wind. The wood was gray and splintered, the windows dark and empty, and the porch sagged like it was tired of holding its own weight. When I was a kid, my parents warned me to never go near it, not because it was unsafe, but because people who went inside sometimes didn't come back. Over the years, 3 people had vanished. First, it was an old farmer who claimed someone was living in the house and stealing his tools. Then, it was a teenage couple looking for a place to hang out at night. The last was a delivery driver whose truck was found parked outside the gate, engine still running. No bodies were ever found, no signs of struggle, just silence. Most of us tried to forget, but the house remained, watching the road like it was waiting for someone else to make a mistake. Last fall, my younger brother dared me to go inside and prove the stories were just rumors. I was home from college, trying to act braver than I felt, so I agreed. We went just before sunset, when the sky was bleeding orange behind the fields. As we approached, the air felt wrong, heavy and damp, like the moment before a storm. My brother stopped at the broken fence, refusing to go further. I laughed at him, told him I'd be in and out in 5 minutes. The front door was already open. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Nobody in town would go near it, so who opened it? I stepped onto the porch and felt the wood dip beneath my feet. Inside, the house smelled like mold and something metallic, like old pennies. The hallway stretched ahead into darkness. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, exposing black stains underneath. I called out, half joking, asking if anyone was home. My voice echoed back to me, but it sounded distorted, slower, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam flickered even though my battery was full. The living room was empty except for muddy footprints covering the floor. They were all leading deeper into the house. None were coming out. My stomach tightened, but I kept moving, telling myself they were old tracks, maybe from the police investigation years ago. Then I noticed something else. On the wall, carved into the paint with something sharp, were names, dozens of them. Some I recognized, the farmer, the teenage couple, even the delivery driver. My heart started pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut behind me. The sound was so violent it shook dust from the ceiling. I ran back and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't turn. I pounded on the door, shouting for my brother, but no sound seemed to leave my mouth. It was like the house swallowed it. Then I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, dragging, one step at a time. I looked up at the ceiling, watching faint cracks form along the plaster as something heavy moved above me. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. The silence that followed felt alive. Then came a whisper, soft and layered, like many voices speaking at once. It said, "Stay." The temperature dropped instantly. My breath fogged in front of me. The muddy footprints on the floor began to shift, as if pressed into the wood by invisible weight. One by one, new prints formed beside them, fresh and wet, appearing right in front of my eyes. They were walking toward me. I stumbled back into the hallway as the staircase began to creak. I forced myself to look. At the top stood a figure, tall and unnaturally thin, its arms hanging too long at its sides. Its face was blurred, like it didn't want to be seen clearly. But I could make out hollow spaces where its eyes should have been. Around it, shapes moved in the darkness, silhouettes pressing against the walls, as if trying to escape from inside them. The figure tilted its head slowly, then stepped down one stair. The sound of its foot hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot. I turned and ran toward the back door, but the hallway stretched longer with every step, the walls narrowing, the air growing thinner. The whispering grew louder, overlapping, desperate voices begging me not to leave them there alone. I reached the kitchen and saw something that made my blood run cold. The back door was open, but instead of fields behind it, there was only darkness, thick and endless. From that darkness, hands reached out, pale and trembling, scratching at the frame. I recognized a ring on one of those hands. It belonged to the farmer who vanished. The tall figure was suddenly behind me. I felt its breath on my neck, icy and rotten. It leaned close and whispered, "They stay with me." I don't remember how I got out. My brother says I burst through the front door screaming, covered in mud, even though it hadn't rained in weeks. He swears the door was never closed. When I looked back, the house stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened. We ran all the way home and told our parents everything. The next morning, the police searched the place again. They found nothing. No carvings on the walls, no footprints, no signs anyone had ever gone missing there. But 3 days later, my brother disappeared. His bed was empty, his window wide open. On the inside of the glass were muddy handprints, small and trembling. And carved into the wooden frame of his bed were 2 words I will never forget. "Come back." Sometimes late at night, I drive past Miller's Road. The house looks darker than the sky around it. And in the second floor window, I see more silhouettes than there should be, standing close together, watching the road, waiting for someone else to walk through that door and never come back. The well that whispers. Your name at night. In the middle of our village, behind the old church and the dying oak tree, there's a stone well that nobody uses anymore, but nobody dares to fill in either. It's been there longer than anyone can remember, older than the asphalt road, older than the power lines, maybe even older than the town itself. When I was a kid, we were told to stay away from it, not because it was deep or dangerous, but because if you listened too closely, it would start talking back. At first, I thought it was just another small-town legend meant to scare children, something parents used to keep us from wandering off. But the older I got, the more I realized the fear in their eyes was real. Years ago, before I was born, a boy named Daniel went missing. The story was that he had been playing near the well at dusk. Some said he fell in, but when they searched it, they found nothing. No body, no water disturbed. Just darkness stretching down further than it should. After that, people began to avoid walking past it at night. They claimed they heard whispers coming from inside, soft voices echoing upward like someone trapped far below. Last month, I moved back home after losing my job in the city. I couldn't sleep most nights, so I started taking late walks to clear my head. One evening, just past midnight, I found myself standing in front of the well. The moonlight barely reached the bottom. I told myself it was just an old hole in the ground, nothing more. Then I heard it, a faint sound drifting upward. At first it was just wind, or so I thought. But then it formed into something clearer. A voice. It sounded distant, stretched thin, like it had traveled a long way to reach me. It whispered, "Hello." I froze. My chest tightened as I leaned slightly closer, telling myself it was my imagination. The voice came again, this time layered with another, and another, overlapping in uneven rhythm. They weren't random sounds. They were words. They were calling names, not just any names, names of people from the village. I stepped back, my heart racing, but curiosity pulled me forward again. I knelt beside the stone edge and looked down. The darkness felt thick, almost solid, like smoke filling a pit. Then, one of the voices changed. It wasn't distant anymore. It was clear. It said my name. I stumbled backwards so fast I scraped my hands on the gravel. The whisper turned into a low murmur, dozens of voices repeating my name in a slow, hypnotic chant. I ran home, and tried to convince myself I was exhausted, stressed, imagining things. But the next night, as I lay in bed, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint echo drifting through my open window. My name, rising and falling like it was carried on the wind. I slammed the window shut, but it didn't stop. The sound wasn't outside. It was inside my head. Over the next few days, more people began to act strangely. Mrs. Harper from the grocery store claimed she heard her late husband calling to her from the well. A teenage boy swore he heard his missing dog barking from deep underground, and every night someone different would wander out after dark, drawn by something they couldn't explain. Then one morning, Mr. Collins didn't show up to open the gas station. His truck was found parked beside the church. The well cover, a heavy iron grate that had been sealed for years, was lying crooked on the grass. I don't remember deciding to go there again, but that evening I stood in front of it, staring at the open mouth of a stone. The air around it felt colder than the rest of the village. The whispers were louder now, clearer, overlapping in urgent desperation. They weren't just calling names anymore. They were begging. "Help us. It's dark. Don't leave." My hands trembled as I stepped closer. I could swear I saw movement below, pale shapes shifting just out of sight. Then, I saw something that made my knees nearly give out. Faces, pressed against the inner stone wall far below, distorted and stretched as if seen through deep water. Their mouths opened and closed, but the sound that came out wasn't screaming. It was pleading. One face drifted upward slightly, and I recognized it. Mr. Collins. His eyes were wide, his skin gray and thin. He lifted a hand slowly, reaching toward me from impossible depth. The voices suddenly stopped all at once. The silence was worse than the noise. Then, a single voice rose above the rest, calm, clear, familiar. It was Daniel, the boy who vanished years ago. He sounded older now, but I recognized him from childhood photos. He whispered, "It's not a well." The ground beneath me trembled lightly, pebbles slipping over the edge and disappearing without a sound of impact. The darkness shifted, expanding like a pupil dilating. Long, pale arms began to emerge from the stone walls, bending at unnatural angles, gripping the edge of the well. I stumbled back as one hand shot upward and wrapped around my wrist. The grip was freezing cold and impossibly strong. Dozens of other hands followed, clawing at the grass, pulling themselves higher. Their faces stretched into smiles too wide for human bones. They weren't trapped, they were climbing. I tore myself free, leaving skin behind in their grip, and ran without looking back. Behind me, I heard the scrape of stone and the soft thud of bodies pulling themselves onto the earth. The next morning, half the village was gone. Houses stood empty, doors open, beds untouched. The well was sealed again, the iron grate perfectly in place, as if it had never moved. But now, when I lie awake at night, I don't hear whispers coming from the center of town. I hear them from beneath my floorboards, soft, patient voices calling my name from below, reminding me that the well was never a hole in the ground. It was an opening, and whatever climbed out is still spreading, house by house, waiting until every voice in this village joins the chorus in the dark. The lake that doesn't let you leave. There's a small village in northern Minnesota that doesn't show up on most maps, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and nothing ever seems to change except for the lake. Graywater Lake sits just beyond the last row of houses, wide and still, surrounded by tall pine trees that block out most of the wind. From a distance, it looks peaceful, almost beautiful, especially at sunrise when the fog rolls across the surface like a living thing. But if you live there long enough, you learn something the tourists never do. The lake doesn't give back what it takes. When I was a kid, my parents warned me not to swim too far from shore. They never explained why, just said the water was deeper than it looked, every few years, someone would disappear. Not always swimmers, sometimes fishermen, sometimes people who were just walking along the dock at night. The official explanation was always the same. Accidents happen, strong currents, sudden cramps. But the strange thing was that no bodies were ever recovered, not once. It was like the lake swallowed them whole. Last summer, I moved back to the village after 10 years away. My father had passed, and I inherited his small house near the trees. The first night I slept there, I heard something that brought back memories I had buried. A low, distant sound drifting through the open window. It wasn't quite a voice, not quite the wind. It was something in between, a hum that rose and fell in uneven rhythm. The next morning, I walked down to the shore. The water was perfectly still, smooth like glass. I noticed something odd near the old wooden dock. Wet footprints, barefoot, leading from the dock into the water. None coming back. I asked around town if anyone had gone swimming early. That's when I learned that a teenage boy named Caleb had gone missing the night before. His parents thought he had snuck out to meet friends. His phone was found on the dock. His shoes were neatly placed beside it. The sheriff dragged the lake for hours. Nothing. No body, no clothing, just endless, dark water. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m. I heard it again. The humming. Louder now. I stepped outside and saw a faint light hovering over the surface of the lake, pale and flickering beneath the water like something glowing from below. Without thinking, I walked toward it. The closer I got, the colder the air became. The humming shifted into something clearer. It wasn't random noise. It was layered, dozens of faint voices overlapping. I stepped onto the dock and looked down. The water wasn't reflecting the moon anymore. It was reflecting something else. Faces, dozens of them, just beneath the surface, pale and distorted as if pressed against invisible glass. Their eyes were open. Their mouths moved slowly, forming silent words. One face drifted closer, clearer than the rest. I recognized it from a missing poster at the gas station, a woman who had vanished 5 years ago. Her hand lifted toward me from beneath the surface, fingers stretching unnaturally long. The humming turned into whispers. Stay. Come down. It's warm. My head felt heavy, my thoughts slowing, as if the sound was wrapping around my mind. I stepped closer to the edge of the dock, my toes hanging over the water. The surface began to ripple, not outward, but inward, like something breathing beneath it. Then I saw Caleb. His eyes were open, but they were wrong, too dark, too empty. He smiled at me from below, and his jaw unhinged wider than it should, releasing a stream of bubbles that formed my name before popping at the surface. Suddenly, a hand shot out of the water and grabbed my ankle. The grip was ice cold and impossibly strong. More hands followed, pale arms emerging silently, wrapping around the dock, pulling themselves upward. The water didn't splash. It barely moved. I fell backward, kicking free just as one of the hands brushed against my skin, leaving a burning cold that sank into my bones. I scrambled off the dock and ran toward the trees. Behind me, I heard the slow sound of wet footsteps stepping onto wood. When I turned back, the dock was empty again. The lake was calm, perfectly smooth, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, 3 more people were gone. No signs of struggle. Just empty houses and damp footprints leading toward the shore. The sheriff tried to close off the area, but it didn't matter. The lake wasn't pulling people in by force. It was calling them. And once you heard it clearly, it was almost impossible to resist. Now, every night, the humming grows louder. It vibrates through the pipes in my house, through the floorboards, through my chest. When I look out my window, I sometimes see silhouettes standing at the edge of the water, perfectly still, staring down as if waiting for instructions. The missing posters in town have started to fade in the sun, but no one takes them down anymore. We all know they're not lost. They're still there, just beneath the surface, watching through the thin layer of water that separates our world from theirs. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and low, I see shapes moving across the lake, not swimming, not floating, but walking slowly along the bottom, their pale faces tilted upward, waiting for the moment when the lake decides it needs more company. And when it does, it won't matter how far you run, because once you hear it call your name from the water, a part of you already belongs to it. They came back after 10 years. 10 years ago, in a quiet farming village in the Midwest, 7 people vanished on the same night without a single trace. It wasn't a stormy night or a night filled with chaos. It was calm, warm, and painfully ordinary. The missing weren't connected in any obvious way. A school teacher, a mechanic, a teenage girl, an elderly couple, a single mother, a deputy sheriff. They all went to bed in their own homes, and by morning they were gone. Doors were locked from the inside, windows sealed, cars still in the driveway. Beds looked like someone had simply evaporated out of them. No signs of struggle, no footprints, no calls for help. The town searched for months. State police got involved. Search parties combed the fields and woods. Nothing was ever found. Eventually, the headlines faded and people tried to move on, but the village was never the same. Houses sat empty, lawns overgrown, family photos still hanging on walls. And then, exactly 10 years later, on the same date, at 3:17 a.m., every single one of them came back. It started with the power flickering across town. Security cameras glitched. Dogs began barking uncontrollably. Then, front doors opened, not forced open, just unlocked and gently pulled inward from the inside. The 7 missing residents walked out of their homes as if they had just woken up from a long sleep. They were barefoot, wearing the same clothes they had disappeared in. They hadn't aged a day. Their skin looked pale, almost gray under the streetlights, and their movements were slow and slightly out of sync, like people learning how to use their bodies again. Neighbors watched from windows in frozen disbelief. Some ran outside, crying, calling their names. The returned didn't respond at first. They just stood there, staring up at the sky like they had never seen it before. Then, one by one, they lowered their heads and smiled. Relief swept through the town like a wave. Families embraced their lost loved ones. Reporters flooded in. Medical teams ran tests. But that's when things became unsettling. The doctors couldn't explain it. Their hearts were beating, but slower than normal. Their body temperatures were several degrees below average. Blood tests showed abnormalities no one could identify. And the strangest detail of all, none of them remembered being gone. They insisted it had only been a single night. They described going to bed and waking up feeling rested. When asked what year it was, they answered correctly. When told 10 years had passed, they laughed, thinking it was a joke. But the laughter always stopped too suddenly, replaced by blank stares that lasted just a little too long. Over the next few weeks, small things began to change. The returned didn't eat much. They claimed they weren't hungry. They avoided bright sunlight, preferring to stand in shaded corners of rooms. They rarely blinked. And sometimes, people caught them whispering to each other in a low murmur that didn't sound like English. At night, lights would flick on inside the once empty houses. Neighbors reported seeing the 7 standing perfectly still in their front yards at 3:17 a.m., facing the same direction, toward the open fields beyond the town. Then, the animals started acting strange. Cattle broke through fences and ran. Birds stopped landing near the village. Dogs whimpered and hid when the returned walked past. One evening, the mechanic's brother claimed he overheard something that made his blood run cold. He said his brother was in the kitchen, speaking softly to someone who wasn't there. When he asked who he was talking to, the mechanic turned slowly and said, "They're almost ready." The next morning, 2 more villagers were missing, a young boy and a grocery store clerk. Same pattern, gone from locked homes, no trace. Security footage from nearby houses showed something disturbing. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the 7 returned residents stepped out of their houses in perfect unison and walked down the street together. Their movements were synchronized now, precise and mechanical. The footage glitched as they passed under streetlights, but for a single clear frame, their shadows were wrong. Each person cast multiple shadows stretching in different directions, as if more than one thing stood in their place. Panic spread quickly. The sheriff ordered everyone indoors after midnight, but it didn't matter. The next disappearances happened in broad daylight. A farmer working in his field, a waitress on her lunch break. Each time, witnesses described the same thing. One of the returned would approach the victim, lean in close, and whisper something no one else could hear. The victim would freeze, eyes unfocused, then calmly walk away with them toward the fields. They were never seen again. Within a month, the population of the village had dropped by nearly half. The remaining residents barricaded themselves inside their homes, watching through curtains as the returned walked the streets at night, their numbers slowly growing. Because that was the most horrifying part. The new missing were coming back too. Days after vanishing, they would reappear just like the original 7. Pale, unaged, smiling too wide, moving in perfect sync. And every night at 3:17 a.m., they all gathered at the edge of town, facing the dark, open fields, whispering in that layered, inhuman murmur. No one knows what's out there in those fields. Some say a sinkhole opened beneath the earth 10 years ago. Others think something arrived that night and never left. I'm one of the few who got out early. I left after I saw my sister, who had been missing for 3 days, standing in our driveway at exactly 3:17 a.m., staring at my bedroom window. She hadn't aged, she hadn't changed. But when she smiled, her jaw opened just a little too wide, and behind her teeth, I saw a movement, like something shifting beneath her skin. Now, whenever I check the news from that region, there are no updates, no reports. It's as if the village no longer exists. The roads leading there don't appear on GPS anymore. And sometimes, at exactly 3:17 a.m., my phone screen flickers on by itself. A notification appears with no sender, just a simple message that fades after a few seconds. We're ready for you. The Witch of Black Hollow Village. If you drive far enough off the highway in West Virginia, past the last gas station and into the mountains where cell service dies, you'll find a village called Black Hollow, though it doesn't appear on most maps anymore. The people who live there don't like strangers, and they don't like questions, especially about the woman who lives at the edge of the woods. They don't call her a witch out loud, but everyone knows that's what she is. When I was a kid, my grandmother used to tell me that every village has something that keeps it alive, something it feeds to stay safe. In Black Hollow, that something was her. The first time I saw the house, I thought it looked abandoned. Crooked chimney, windows covered in black fabric, a garden full of plants that looked more like bones than flowers. The air around it felt thick, like walking into a room where someone had just been arguing. I had moved to Black Hollow after inheriting my grandmother's old cabin. I didn't believe in witch stories. I believed in bad reputations and small-town paranoia. But the villagers avoided the forest after sunset, and every October they nailed protective symbols to their doors. When I asked about it at the diner, conversations stopped. Forks froze mid-air. Someone finally muttered, "As long as she stays in the woods, we're fine." I learned quickly that people had gone missing over the years. Not many, just enough to keep the fear alive. A hunter who never came back from tracking a deer. A teenage girl who dared her friends to knock on the witch's door. A drifter passing through town. The sheriff always blamed the forest. Ravines, wild animals, accidents. But no bodies were ever found. One night, about a month after I moved in, I woke to the sound of knocking. 3 slow taps against my front door. It was 2:13 a.m. I checked the window. No one was there. The forest was silent. I told myself it was branches hitting the wood. Then the knocking came again, this time from the back door. 3 slow taps. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. That's when I saw her, standing at the tree line, tall and impossibly thin, her silhouette barely moving. Her hair hung long and tangled, almost blending into the darkness behind her. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I felt her watching me. The air seemed to hum around her. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. She lifted one hand slowly, crooked fingers bending in a motion that wasn't quite a wave. Then she turned and stepped backward into the woods, disappearing between the trees without a sound. The next morning, I found something nailed to my door. A bundle of twigs tied together with black thread wrapped around a small animal skull. The villagers wouldn't look at it when I showed them. An old man at the diner finally whispered, "She marks who she wants." That night, I locked every door and window. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't just at the doors. It was on the walls, the windows, the ceiling. Slow, deliberate taps, moving around the house like something circling prey. I covered my ears, but the sound was inside now, echoing in my head. Then came the whispering. Soft at first, almost like wind through leaves, but forming words I couldn't fully understand. My name was buried somewhere in the murmurs. I made the mistake of looking outside again. She was closer this time, standing in my yard. The moonlight revealed more of her face. Her eyes were too dark, too deep, like holes carved into skin stretched tight over bone. Her mouth curved into a smile that showed teeth filed to sharp points. She raised both hands, and the trees behind her began to sway, though there was no wind. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground, reaching toward my house like fingers. The knocking stopped abruptly. The silence was worse. Then every light in my cabin flickered and died. I stood frozen in the dark as I heard the front door creak open slowly, even though I knew I had locked it. Soft footsteps crossed the wooden floor, not hurried, not aggressive, calm, certain. The whispering grew louder, layered voices speaking through her mouth. "You don't belong," they said, "but you will." I felt cold breath against my ear and the faint brush of fingers against the back of my neck. I turned, but the room was empty. Suddenly, I was outside. I don't remember walking out. I was standing at the edge of the woods facing her house. The door was open, warm yellow light spilling out into the darkness. My legs moved on their own, carrying me forward. Inside, the walls were covered in symbols carved deep into the wood. Jars lined the shelves, each holding something that looked disturbingly human. Hair, teeth, what might have been fingertips. In the center of the room stood a large iron pot, steam rising from within. She stood beside it, watching me with that same impossible smile. "The village must remain," she said, her voice layered with many others. "And the village must give." I realized then that she wasn't hunting randomly. The villagers weren't her victims. They were her protection. Every disappearance was an offering, a trade for safety, for good harvests, for peace. And now, I was the outsider. The balance demanded something new. She reached toward me, her fingers stretching longer than they should, wrapping around my wrist with unnatural strength. The room darkened, the walls seeming to breathe as the whispering rose into a deafening chant. I don't know how I escaped. I remember fire. I remember the smell of smoke and her scream, a sound that didn't belong to any human throat. When I woke up, I was lying in the dirt outside my cabin. The forest edge was blackened and burned. The villagers claimed her house had always been abandoned. They said there was no witch, no fire. But that night, at exactly 2:13 a.m., there were 3 slow knocks on every door in Black Hollow. And this time, when the villagers looked out their windows, they didn't see her at the tree line. They saw me, standing in the shadows of the forest, smiling with teeth that felt sharper than they used to be. The Soul Taker of Hollow Creek. There's a village in the backroads of Kentucky called Hollow Creek, the kind of place where time feels slower and the nights feel longer than they should. People there don't lock their doors because they trust their neighbors, but they still won't step outside after midnight. They won't say it directly, not to strangers, but they believe something walks those roads when the clock hits 12:07 a.m. Something that doesn't steal money or jewelry or lives in the way you'd expect. It steals something quieter, something you can't see until it's gone. The first time I heard about the Soul Taker, I thought it was just another rural legend, a story to scare kids into behaving. But then I met Mr. Grady. He was sitting outside the general store, staring at nothing, his eyes open but empty. People said he used to be the loudest man in town, always laughing, always telling stories. Now, he barely spoke. When he did, his voice sounded distant, like it was echoing from the bottom of a well. They said he was taken 3 years ago. Not killed, not attacked, just taken. According to the story, he had been walking home late at night when he saw a tall figure standing in the middle of the dirt road. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, thin and unnaturally still, wearing what looked like a long black coat that hung too straight, unaffected by the wind. Mr. Grady claimed the figure had no face, just smooth, pale skin where features should have been. When he tried to step around it, it lifted one long arm and touched his chest. He said it didn't hurt. It felt cold. That was all. The next morning, he was found sitting on his porch, staring ahead, his expression blank. Since then, he hasn't been the same. And he isn't the only one. Over the past decade, 12 people in Hollow Creek have had the same experience. They don't go missing, they don't die, they just change. They stop laughing, stop caring, stop reacting. Doctors call it trauma, severe dissociation, but the villagers know better. They say the Soul Taker doesn't need your body. It just needs what's inside. I moved to Hollow Creek last fall, looking for quiet after years in the city. I rented a small house near the woods. The first few weeks were peaceful, almost too peaceful. Then I noticed something strange. Every night at exactly 12:07 a.m., the air would grow heavy, like the world was holding its breath. The insects would stop chirping, the wind would die, even the old clock in my kitchen would seem to tick softer. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped outside at 12:05 and waited on my porch. At first, nothing happened. Then the silence deepened, pressing against my ears until it almost hurt. And there it was, at the far end of the road, standing under the broken streetlight, tall, thin, completely still. It didn't walk toward me. It didn't need to. The shadows around it stretched unnaturally long, creeping down the road like dark water. I couldn't see a face, but I felt its attention lock onto me. My chest tightened, my breath shallow. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It began to glide forward, not stepping, not making a sound, just closing the distance without effort. The closer it got, the colder the air became. I could see now that its coat wasn't fabric. It looked like smoke clinging to a shape. When it stopped at the edge of my yard, I noticed something worse. Inside the darkness where its face should have been, faint shapes moved, like reflections. I realized they weren't reflections. They were faces, dozens of them, faint and overlapping, their mouths open in silent screams. The Taken. It raised its hands slowly, fingers too long, joints bending at wrong angles. When it pressed its palm against my chest, I felt something pull, not physically, but deeper, Like a hook sliding into my ribs and tugging, memories flashed in my mind. My childhood, my mother's laugh, the first time I felt truly happy. And then I felt them slipping away, like pages being torn from a book. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring into that shifting darkness. Then suddenly, a porch light across the street flicked on. The figure turned its head slightly toward the light, and in that second of distraction, I stumbled backward and fell. When I looked up again, it was gone. The night sounds returned all at once, insects screaming into the darkness. I lay there shaking, convinced I had imagined it, until the next morning. I tried to call my sister, someone I talked to every week. When she answered, I felt nothing, no warmth, no familiarity. I knew who she was, but the emotional connection was gone, like a wire had been cut. As the days passed, more pieces faded. Music I used to love sounded empty. Food tasted dull. Laughter felt forced. I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the flat expression staring back. The villagers noticed. They always do. They gave me the same look they give the others. Pity mixed with fear. Now I understand the truth about Hollow Creek. The Soul Taker doesn't haunt the village, it farms it. It returns every night at 12:07, choosing carefully, taking only enough to survive, leaving the body behind as a shell. And the faces inside its darkness aren't trophies, they're fuel. I still sit on my porch sometimes, waiting for it to come back. Not because I want revenge, not because I want answers, but because I feel something missing inside me, a hollow space where fear used to live. And last night, when the clock struck 12:07, I didn't see it at the end of the road. I saw it standing in my yard, perfectly still, waiting. And for the first time, I realized it wasn't here to take what little I have left. It was here to give something back. Because when I smiled at my reflection this morning, the expression didn't feel empty anymore. It felt hungry. The cemetery that calls after midnight. There's a small village in rural Pennsylvania where the houses sit close together, but the cemetery sits far apart, pushed back against a line of dead trees, as if the town itself wanted distance from what was buried there. During the day, it looks ordinary. Just crooked headstones, faded flowers, and a rusted iron gate that screeches when you open it. But after midnight, when the wind dies and the sky turns heavy and black, the sounds begin. I grew up in that village, and ever since I was a child, I remember waking up to something echoing through the valley. At first I thought it was animals, coyotes maybe, or the wind passing through broken branches. But the older I got, the clearer it became. The sounds weren't howls, they were knocks, slow, hollow thuds, like wood hitting wood, coming from beneath the earth. Every family in town pretends not to hear it. When you bring it up, they shrug and say, "Old ground shifts at night." But no one walks near the cemetery after dark, and every house has thicker curtains facing that direction. 10 years ago, a groundskeeper named Harold went missing. He was last seen locking the cemetery gate just before midnight. His truck was found still running outside the entrance, headlights pointed toward the rows of graves. The gate was open. They searched the entire area, no footprints leaving, no signs of struggle. It was as if the cemetery swallowed him whole. After that, the sounds got louder. Not every night, just enough to remind us. Last summer, I moved back to take care of my mother after my father passed. On my first night home, I heard it again. 3 slow knocks, spaced evenly apart. Then silence. Then 3 more. I checked the clock. 12:33 a.m. The pattern repeated for nearly an hour. The next morning, I asked my mother if she heard it. She went pale and told me never to count the knocks. When I asked why, she just said, "Because if you reach the end, it hears you counting." That night, I couldn't help myself. When the knocking started, I counted quietly in my head. 3. Pause. 3. Pause. It continued over and over until I reached 33. On the 33rd knock, the sound changed. It wasn't coming from the cemetery anymore. It was coming from beneath our house. A hollow thud echoed under the floorboards, directly below where I was standing. I froze. The next knock came from the hallway. Then, the kitchen. Then directly behind my bedroom door. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, there were faint scratches along the inside of the door, as if something had dragged its fingers down the wood. I decided to go to the cemetery in daylight, trying to prove to myself that fear was playing tricks on me. The iron gate groaned as I pushed it open. Everything looked normal at first, but as I walked between the graves, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Fresh dirt. Several graves had been disturbed, the soil slightly sunken as if something beneath had shifted. On one headstone, Harold's name had been carved recently. The groundskeeper who vanished. There had never been a funeral. No body was found. Yet there was his grave, and beneath his name, someone had etched a single word. Listening. That night, the knocking began earlier than usual. 12:17 a.m. This time, it wasn't just knocking. It was scratching. A dragging, splintering sound like fingernails clawing through wood. I forced myself to look out the window toward the cemetery. In the distance, faint lights flickered between the headstones, small pale glows rising and falling as if something moved with lanterns below ground. The knocking grew frantic, no longer slow and spaced, but desperate and uneven. Then I heard something else. A voice. Faint at first, barely audible over the pounding. It was coming from outside my front door. "Help me," it whispered. I knew that voice. It sounded like my father. My chest tightened. I stepped toward the door before I caught myself. He was buried in that cemetery. I had stood at his funeral. The voice came again, clearer now. "It's cold down here." My hand hovered over the doorknob. That's when I remembered what my mother said about counting, about reaching the end. The knocking suddenly stopped. The silence was crushing. Then, from every direction at once, a single massive thud shook the house, strong enough to rattle the windows. I looked back toward the cemetery. The ground there was moving, not violently, but steadily, like something beneath was pushing upward in dozens of places at once. Shapes began to rise between the graves, dark figures pulling themselves free from the earth without disturbing the soil. They didn't stumble like corpses. They stood upright immediately, heads tilted toward the village, toward the houses, toward me. My phone buzzed in my hand. A notification with no number attached, just an audio file. I didn't press play, but it started on its own. It was the sound of knocking. 3 slow thuds. Pause. 3 slow thuds. And underneath it, layered voices whispering in unison, "We heard you counting." The next morning, half the graves in the cemetery were empty. Not dug up, just hollow. And several houses in the village were open, doors wide, beds untouched. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away. Only faint scratch marks on the inside of the doors, as if something had patiently knocked until it was invited in. Now, every night at 12:33 a.m., I hear it again. The knocking starts in the distance, slow and steady. I don't count anymore. No one does. Because we've realized the truth too late. The sounds from the cemetery aren't something trying to get out. They're something trying to be let in. And eventually, if you listen long enough, it stops knocking and starts using your voice instead.